So the next thing we want to talk about too is now we have the central contributions to motor control, and what we're going to talk about now is there a possibility for your central nervous system to store and have this creation of multiple motor programs and commands without needing feedback, right? So can the instructions for movement be structured ahead of time within the central nervous system? And are these movement programs executed without regard to the effect they have on the environment, right? So is that the ability for us to remove the need for feedback? And when we do this, it's the idea of, with feedback, you're talking about a closed loop system. You perform a task, you provide some sort of feedback to the system, and then that creates some sort of ability to adjust or manipulate the process. But in these open loop systems, there may be ability for us to do this without feedback, and that's what we're going to talk about now going forward in this lecture. And so this idea with an open loop process is, again, we have the very first two portions of this, right? So we have the executive, which is where the information processing happens. You have the effector, which is where the instructions or the output and the movement blueprint is created to the effector, which is really the neuromuscular system and the excitation or inhibition of certain muscles and motor units to create the motion. And then you have some sort of output. And what you're seeing is missing here is this feedback that comes up to the reference of correctness and has this error, and then it comes back up, right? So now you've completed the task and you've done the output. So we're lacking those two components, the feedback loop and the reference of correctness. And therefore, what we have is the sensory receptors, proprioception, as well as vision, hearing, and everything that takes in those components of the environment in your body and the movement are removed, and you just complete the task. So now what happens at this, in order for this to happen, is this theory that within your executive level, there are packages of instructions that are made and created and stored that assist us in developing this program of motion. And so then the effector carries out these programs with any ability to modify the output, right? So there's no feedback coming in and no reflexive work coming back in to modify that program. And one of the theories and one of the hypotheses is this response chain. And the idea is that movement begins, and this is generally for all movement, regardless open or closed chain, with this muscular contraction. It is caused by either an internal or external stimuli, right? Because there could be something in your environment that creates this reaction to this movement, or it could be just a thought process and you wanted to do it. So the sensory information is created, and it's the same as other stimuli, but it triggers the next contraction. What does that mean? Well, think about this, is we have a movement one, right? And so movement one we create. Now, what happens is the output in this creates the response for movement two. So movement two is dependent upon the outcome of movement one. But what movement two is in this hypothesis is movement two is independent of movement one. However, it does relate to the outcome of movement one, right? And so what this is meaning is this external stimuli or internal stimuli of movement two is created by movement one. And some people would argue that running and walking are kind of a component of this, especially when you're doing a trail run, right? So it's not really that you're modifying the motor commands or the motor pattern from the first movement and you continue to modify it. See, simply that your next cycle or your next stride or step is a response to how your foot hits the ground. So you have to manipulate your pattern to adjust for that, whether I step on a rock or whether I step on an incline or a decline. But so what you have to understand with this response chain hypothesis is movement, the next movement is a direct response of the completion of the previous movement and its output. So it's not that it is a closed chain. Remember, this is an open chain. So response chain is an open network, so it's not a closed. And what you're doing is whatever the output is of the previous determines the pattern for the next one. So each action is a series, right? So it's triggered by the movement produced feedback of the previous action. And don't let this idea of feedback get you confused, right? Because feedback in a closed chain is it's responsible for manipulating the exact same thing to make sure that you're tracking or doing a better job at your motor program. This one is the movement output triggers the next movement pattern. And so that is where this feedback comes from. It's the external stimuli that creates a muscle contraction in the reciprocal triggered contraction for the next one. Then that is how this is different from the closed loop system, is that instead of the feedback manipulating the current pattern and trying to just adjust it, it's the feedback that produced is the outcome of the previous movement that triggers some sort of movement pattern to go forward. So the other idea how this differs is that when we're talking about the response chain hypothesis, the only contraction that is thought to be done consciously is that initial one, which is that movement one. So this is the only one that is thought to be conscious. Therefore, each of the subsequent movements are unconscious, and they are just a result of whatever the output response is from the first or previous movement. And so you're just doing it unconsciously, and it's really a result of the proprioception that's happening in the system, and really how you're providing the feedback. And those trigger, and again, I'm going to keep using that word trigger because this response chain hypothesis is a triggered response based off of the environmental feedback, but not to manipulate the previous movement, but to continue and choose a different movement. And we'll understand more about that as we go forward and how we can choose multiple movements, right? But again, it lacks an error message because it doesn't have the reference of correctness, and it doesn't have a feedback to create the error, right? So this is not happening in a response chain hypothesis. And so one of the things that has been used to help support this theory is this deafferentation, and it's basically the interruption of the flow of sensory info to the spinal cord, and mostly from the spinal cord back up to the higher central or nervous system. So what happens is that oftentimes this information goes back to the spinal cord, but it doesn't go to the higher levels of the spinal cord. And so this is a showing or providing evidence that there are levels of motor patterns represented at the level of the spinal cord. In this dorsal rhizotomy is a very interesting thing where in cats back in the day, and I'm pretty sure somebody's probably doing it now, but it happened a lot back in the day where they would sever at the dorsal root of the cerebellum, they would sever the spinal cord, right? And so what you would not have the ability for the mechanism or the feedback or the sensory input to go to levels of the brain to have that information processing. Now, but the efferent motor component is left intact, right? So what that is that there's the ability of the motor pattern to generate from the spinal cord to the flexors and extensors of movement to create the movement. And this was done in cats. And what this does is it still allows the muscles to be activated without having the sensory information from the peripheral muscles and motor units to go back to the spinal cord and the brain. And so this eliminates feedback from the muscles based on the sensory receptors. So when it's interrupting that flow of the spinal cord, it's that dorsal root, the afferent root coming back. And so it has the inability for them to generate or create these movements based off that sensory input coming back to it from the GTOs, the proprioceptor, the muscle spindles, all those kind of things. But it allows them to generate and see if they have the ability to manipulate their gait patterns or movement. So this provides evidence to feedback not being essential for movement to occur, but what feedback does do, it aids in the accuracy of movement, right? In some movements, when we start talking about fine motor skills, there needs to be some sort of tactile or some other form of feedback provided, but these are really providing, like if we're walking or running or gross motor patterns, that sometimes we don't need to rely on that sensory input or that feedback. And we just kind of respond and put our footfall down. And so this dorsal rhizotomy for cats was done really on a treadmill. And so there's some great videos out there if you want to research it that shows how a cat was able to increase its gait speed based on the increasing of the treadmill speed in response to it. Now, in humans, we cannot sever a dorsal root going back to the spinal cord, right? It's just not humane, and they're not going to allow us to do it. But what they've done is they've done an anesthetic to the joints, and they've also done occlusion. So they've done blood pressure cuffs for 20 minutes to remove any of the sensory feedback, and they found it similar to occur in humans as well, right? Now, if we sever that spinal cord at the higher orders, how is gait maintained? And that's the question with this process, and that's where the support goes for these open chain movements, is that it doesn't need to have that sensory input, that you're just responding to where your next footfall is, and it just creates this motor pattern.